Can people hear me all right? Great, excellent. Well, welcome. Thank you, who is also a fellow committee member and who will be presenting on the fascinating subject of how to compose cadenzas and embellishments of fermatas in late Baroque and early classical music. Dr. Nivison is the Director of Instrumental Music at Longleaf School of the Arts and Artistic Director for Raleigh Camerata Early Music Ensemble in Raleigh, North Carolina. And in addition to teaching and performing, she also specializes in the restoration and curation of historical flutes and pianos. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you all to Dr. Kelly Nivison.
Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here. I'm absolutely wonderful and enthralled that there's so many people here. Oh, sorry. But anyway, this presentation is going to go over the historical context for cadenzas, what the treatise writers state about cadenzas and fermatas, the rules that they gave in the time period. I'm going to give you examples from treatises, and then I'm also going to give you a set of rules that I've created based off of what these treatise writers have said and help you learn how to create your own cadenzas. If you're anything like me, when you get this daunting task of there's a fermata in this cadenza and your teacher now says you cannot use any printed cadenza out there, right? Your face goes white. You go, oh crap, I'm not a composer. What do I do, right? I personally do a lot better when I have rules and guidelines and basically bumper guards. Okay, start here, move to this. These are your possibilities and go from there versus an infinite array of things. So I hope this gives you your guardrails and your bumper guards so you feel a little bit more comfortable writing your own cadenzas. So there's two places that we're going to talk about embellishment today, fermatas versus marked cadenzas. Your fermata or your Eingänge is going to be usually a dominant seventh chord. It's usually found at a cadence point right before either a recapitulation or a da capo, a return from B back to the A section of a piece. Versus a cadenza is usually found at the ending section of a movement, a succession of a 6/4 to a 5/3 chord in the dominant key. And it's just before the very end of the solo. Performers are expected to compose something to entertain the audience and not always necessarily using melodies found within the piece. Quantz states that the object of the cadenza is to simply surprise the listener unexpectedly at the end of a piece and to leave behind a special impression in his heart. So that's the ultimate goal. So first we're going to go through a survey of literature. What do they say about fermatas? What do they say about cadenzas? So we're going to start with the fermatas, the Eingänge, the fermatas that happen right before your da capo or your recapitulation. Sometimes writers state that minimal to even no embellishment is even needed. Sometimes Schubert says a portamento or a slide between notes would suffice. So you don't always have to heavily embellish just because there's a fermata in the music there. And in French music or in French-influenced music, sometimes a fermata can mean a point d'arrêt or a point de repos, which is a point of rest or a repose, where it's basically creating a poignant pause. So not every fermata that you see in this music is going to mean embellishment. It could mean take time. You're preparing a new section. So it's important to assess the piece that you're doing and really say, do I really need to embellish here? So a few examples from treatise writers for your basic fermatas, your Eingänge. Here we have examples from C.P.E. Bach. This is obviously a modern edition, so it's not the original manuscript here. But what he does give, so here's my pointer. He'll give one measure of what might be written in the piece with the two fermatas, and then an example of how he would compose it here. And this goes in succession. So here's another what might be in the piece and what the performer might come up with here. So his Versuch on the art of playing keyboard instruments is a great resource for the examples here. Sure, you can take this as a flutist. It is written for keyboard, but whatever the right hand does, you can take that as a flutist for examples. As wind instruments, we very much went after the vocal model. So here is an example from Domenico Cori of what a vocalist might do. So here's the fermata right before the cadence and the da capo. And here's 3 different versions of what a vocalist might do, from simple to medium complexity to a whole lot of melismas, right? So there's a wide variety that you can do. And you notice the vocal versions are rather short because vocalists want to keep it within a breath. Usually you won't want to do much more than what you can do in one breath. And then on the right here, we have from Gottlieb Turk. This is also another piano keyboard treatise. Again, just like the CPE, he gives you what might be seen in the music versus what you might actually play. So you should be able to see a common theme between all of these, that the Eingang or the da capo recap fermata is not a very long embellishment, okay, from all of these examples that we see. All right, moving on to cadenzas. This is a basic allotment of what treatise writers say about the cadenzas. You have the full quotations in your notes if you got one of the handouts. If I ran out of handouts, there's links on the online guidebook to the handout that you can get as well. So CPE says elaborations must be related to the affect of a movement, and affect is the feeling of the movement. If it's a slow movement, it needs to be in that slow movement style. It needs to be legato. It needs to be smooth. Turk says the embellishment ought only to be based on the given harmony. So if you have a piece in G major, you're probably not going to want to do E flat major harmonies. You'd be surprised. In vocal arias, embellished fermatas should not exceed what is possible in a single breath. Breathing tended to halt the momentum, they said. So the more you took a breath in your embellishments, the more you halted the momentum of your embellishment, your Eingang, your cadenza. Quantz says regular time is seldom to be observed in cadences. So you might write it out metered, but you're not going to play metronomically. You're actually going to play exactly the opposite. Okay. Quantz also says those for wind instruments ought to be short and so managed that they may be performed in one breath. So similar to the vocal model. And even Quantz says it is nevertheless very hard to make them on the spot without having agreed beforehand. So this is even in 1750 saying, I wrote them down. He did not come up with them on the stage. Sorry, it's my G-chat. I forgot to turn that off. But so even in the time period, they figured out their cadenzas and their embellishments beforehand. He said it was hard to do it on the spot, and he did not expect performers to do it on the spot. And if you did it on the spot, he was actually very impressed with you. And if you're doing a duet or a trio, or you're doing it within a symphony or something, it's imperative that you figure it out beforehand, is what they said. All right, Charles de Luz, in his Art of the Transverse Flute in 1760, he wrote a bunch of preludes and caprices as part of this treatise that was in the end part of the treatise on playing the flute. These were modeled after violin writing of the time. And he said they were suitable exercises for exercising the embouchure and the fingers. He also stated that they can be used at the end of concertos for the flute. But he did say that there is a little asterisk at the end of these. This one in the modern edition's right there. You can see. So from here to the end is what you could use as a cadenza for a concerto. And he has 12 of these in a variety of different keys. They all have a little star or a cross here toward the end, last couple measures, and that's the length that he recommended for cadenzas at this time. And again, this is 1760, so this is kind of the time of CPE for the most part. One mention in the notes, I do have one error. It's in variable. The second you click print or send to printer to print, you will find an error, right? So there's a lot that says Deleuze did this, and all of a sudden it says Haute-Terre did this. Haute-Terre did not do this. It's all Deleuze. So you can just cross out Haute-Terre in this little section and say, whoops, I'm sorry. All right, here's another example from Tartini. So a little bit later, this is 1770. He talks, a lot of his treatise talks about how to add embellishments at cadence points in general, and this would be like your da capo or your right before recapitulation type embellishments, so it's a good source for that. But he also talks about actual cadenzas. When you have the first fermata, he says you should kind of outline the harmony of that first fermata and use sequences and patterns to get through the harmonies, and then you change your harmony, do something else, and then you trill, basically. So he gives you like this piecemeal formula, if you want to say, for how to do this. And then he gives you all these different ways to do sequences between these harmonies and different things you can do. And there's pages and pages of this providing you different options for how you can do sequences to get to different harmonies, okay? And then on the right here is his version of a cadenza. So again, see, it's about maybe 3 to 4 measures worth in length, okay? But he gives you multiple different solutions to harmony problems, whether you start higher or if you start lower in tessitura. This is the higher tessitura page. But again, lots of different options and examples for what cadenzas would be. So 1770, the cadenza is still not really long, is it? It's still rather short, even for cadenzas. So. All right, so now we're getting into Mozart's era, and we have a treasure trove with Mozart because he wrote cadenzas for his students in his concertos. So we're going to go over some specifics of that and how we might transfer that to what we do with the Mozart concertos for flute. So he wrote all of his cadenzas out in special editions for his students. These were not in the official published editions that went out to the publishers for sale across Europe. But this was meant to kind of teach his students what the cadenza might look like on the keyboard, because presumably even in that era, they probably didn't want to compose their own cadenzas either. He follows a similar pattern for all of them. He has an opening that largely stays within the harmony of that ending fermata. He has a middle section, which is where you have a variety of sequences and scalar passages. And then you have a closing section that has your ultimate trill on scale degree 2 or 7 that resolves. But across the board in all of his concertos, all of his cadenzas are roughly 10%, give or take, of the movement. And that's an important number to realize, okay? Eva and Paul Badura-Skoda also talk about, he has a tendency to bridge the gap. And this is where the harmony and the motives used at the beginning of the cadenza are very similar to the thematic material right before the fermata. So it kind of bridges that where the cadenza morphs out of what the orchestra just ended with. So it's not orchestra ends, flute does something completely different, right? You want to kind of bridge over where it just kind of grows out of it, and then you kind of take center stage. So this chart, there's a lot of numbers here. You don't need to pay attention to all of them. The important ones I've highlighted in yellow, okay? And this comes from one of the articles that I linked in the bibliography on the Mozart concertos if you want to read more about what the author said about it. But here we have the total number of measures in the concerto, the number of measures that Mozart wrote for his example of the cadenza, and the percentage of what that cadenza was. And so you can see it ranges roughly from 9% to 12% as far as measure total length. And you have to keep in mind violin and keyboard cadenzas were always longer than wind and vocal cadenzas. So 10% is like the maximum you would want to do to be historically accurate. If you don't care about being historically accurate, you can do whatever you want, right? But if you care about being historically accurate and true to Mozart, you need to be under 10%, okay? So we have drums, yay. To compare, for the G major concerto, the first movement has 219 measures. So our cadenza needs to be less than 21 measures, okay? The D major concerto is 188 measures for the first movement, so that means we need to be under 18 to 19 measures. We need to be less than that. So that's your first like goalpost when you're writing your cadenza, right? All right, so we have all these examples and everything, but you know, we are going to be remiss if we thought that everybody in the time period did it perfectly and there was no complaints, and it's not that it was a modern phenomenon that people went off the deep end and did these 3-minute long cadenzas and everything. That's actually the furthest thing from the truth. There is a lot of people in the time period that are like, oh, this is a time for me to shine and for everybody to listen to me, and I'm going to take all the time in the world because I'm the most important person ever. And so there's a lot of composers, there are newspaper article writers, there are treatise writers that caution people and criticize musicians about how long they took in their cadenzas. So you can read the quote there from Turk. I have 3 in the notes here, but the funniest one I think is the one that Dr. Burney posted about Handel. And at a concert, I'll read it out for you. One night while Handel was at the harpsichord in Dublin, Dubourg having a solo violin part in a song, and was close to making an ad libitum, which is a cadenza, he wandered about in different keys a great while and seemed indeed a little bewildered and uncertain of his original key. But at length, coming to the shaker trill, which was to terminate this long close, Handel, to the great delight of the audience and augmentation of applause, cried out, loud enough to be heard in the most remote parts of the theater, "You are welcome home, Mr. Dubourg." So even in the time period, people just kind of went off the deep end on cadenzas. So, all right, and modern writers also caution against it. They say, quoted Paul and Eva Badura-Scotto again, saying that modern players often put a tumor in an otherwise healthy organism. An anachronistic cadenza that undermines the stylistic continuity of the piece. So we know what the treatise writers have said now. We know what people have cautioned against. That's all wonderful, all right? But how do I actually write one of these, right? I still don't have my guidelines. I still don't have my parameters, right? So here are your general guidelines. These are your bumper guards. The earlier the composer, the shorter the cadenza is going to be. So a CPE cadenza is going to be a whole lot shorter than a Mozart cadenza. It's going to be a whole lot shorter than like Molique, or romantic composers are going to be even longer, right? You're going to start with thematic material from within that movement. Okay, so again, bridging the gap. Oftentimes, people that wrote out their cadenzas in the time period, they used the thematic material that was just heard right before the fermata, because again, it helps to bridge the gap. You're going to use closely related keys. So obviously your tonic and your dominant, right? You're going to use your parallel and relative minors, and you might modulate briefly to the dominant or keys around the knot to tonicize your dominant, okay? But you're not going to go much further than that. You can go around like a circle of fifths progression in sequencing if you have enough time, but you kind of want to stay close to your home key area. You want to use a variety of melodic ideas. You don't want to stick with that one theme the whole cadenza, because then it kind of gets boring, right? Again, remember, you're supposed to have something special in the heart for your audience members is what you're supposed to trigger. You want to stay within the tessiture of a piece. So if you're writing the Mozart cadenzas, you don't want to be playing high Cs. No high B flats. No low Cs or low Bs, because Mozart, unless you're playing the harp concerto, did not use low Cs, right? Write it out metered. You don't have to do everything in 4/4. It could be a 4/4, a 3/4, a 2/4, a 6/4, but write it out metered, but be very fluid with your tempo, and your tempo changes. And then always play in the affect of the movement. If it's a fast movement with a lot of leaps and bounciness, then your cadenza wants to mimic that as well. Okay. In general, if you're looking at pre-written cadenzas or wanting to take something pre-written and make it your own, a really great place to start is anything written by Rachel Brown. She has a couple sets of published cadenzas for a variety of works, and that's a great place to start from and examine other things based on that. All right, so here we're going to examine some specific stuff with the pieces. The Mozart concertos, first movements, you're going to want to keep it roughly to 2 to 4 lines. So shorter than 20 measures, and remember that the more you take a breath, the more you're going to halt your momentum. So when you're composing, start with the melodic idea you begin with. Pick your theme first, right? Map out your available keys. Figure out the sequence and patterns that you want to use to navigate between the keys you want to use. And always end with a trill on scale degree 2 or 7 that resolves to 1. This is going to be your 5 or 5/7 chord that resolves to a 1 chord. All right, here's a little more specificity for each concerto from Mozart. You are on the dominant chord. These are your key areas. Your dominant of A major, your secondary dominant of E major to tonicize that dominant. Your relative minor is B minor. Your parallel minor would be D minor. And of course, your tonic is D major, which you want to save to the very end of your cadenza. Nothing is worse as an audience member for you to play around in D major and then go somewhere else and then go back to D major because you just faked out your audience that you're going to cadence, right? And the orchestra, they're not going to like you either because they don't know when to come back in. So don't do that. In the left-hand corner here is an example of a cadenza for length. That would be appropriate. You can go a little shorter, you can go a little longer. There are some people that do insanely short, but oddly enough, when I was looking on YouTube for a good representative recording for a cadenza, I spent hours looking at videos, trying to find somebody that didn't literally spend 2 minutes on their cadenza, or do high A's and B flats, or go on some weird tonal trip to weird harmonies that were no way in any way, shape, or fashion related to the key of D major, okay? So I was really surprised at that. But this recording here is a really good example, in my opinion, of it's on the longer side, but it does a good job of bridging the gap, staying within relative tonal areas and whatnot, and good thematic material. Behind her knew as soon as she started doing D major scales. Time to go, right? So that's why you want to save that tonic right until the end there. All right, the Mozart Andante in C is essentially, it's a concerto, but it's a middle movement, right? So our cadenza needs to be shorter, and it needs to be lyrical, okay? This is an example of this person largely used this written out cadenza but he kind of made it his own, and he ended a little bit differently than what's written here. So you can take pre-written cadenzas and you can modify them too if you don't want to completely create it, but you need to know what's good, what's bad, how to analyze it, and what parameters you're looking for. All right, Eingänge and other transitional fermatas with Mozart. Again, much shorter, stem from what vocalists did before the capo arias. You should not use thematic material, unlike a regular cadenza. So this is going to be basically a sequence. I call them noodles. So like you take a spaghetti noodle, you throw it on the table, and it kind of makes this shape. That's essentially what you're going to be doing with your music. And the length should, again, only be within the realm of what you can play in one breath, maybe two. All right, here's some examples for Quantz. And what's at the top here is from the original manuscript for the Quantz concerto, so you can see what he actually wrote. He does have a fermata right here before a recapitulation of the main theme. And then you have your cadenza here. He does not have a fermata, but you can see somebody wrote in pencil here, cadenza, because of the succession of the harmony and whatnot. This would be a place that you could have put a cadenza. So it's kind of inferred that the fermata is there. So that's why we do that. So I have two examples from this person here. So Quantz is much earlier than Mozart, so the cadenza length should be 2 lines at most. It should definitely be shorter. So this is an example of what a transitional fermata would have been. And you'll notice that quite frequently with these transitional fermatas, sometimes they're on the penultimate note, sometimes they're on the last note, but quite frequently the embellishment happens between these 2 notes here, your penultimate note and your final note. And you sometimes will have a tag that gets you back into the thematic material. Okay. Not much to it, right? And then here's an example of what would be an appropriate cadenza here. Oh, buffer. Short and sweet, right? All right, something different. Your Handel sonata in B minor. We have a fermata, but we should embellish it every fermata, right? This is an example of French influence for Handel. This is actually one of your point of repos. This is your pausing point, or a pregnant pause. The reason why we know this is because after it, we have these long note values. And we have this basically grand pause here. So you have to use your context clues. If you do embellish at the A sharp there, it should be very short and minimal. You shouldn't do much at all because your main embellishment is going to be here. And these last three measures are kind of stemming from the unmeasured preludes like Couperin used to do, which is example here of what on his harpsichord they would have done. It's you're outlining sequences and stuff within a harmony, and you're noodling around within harmonies and going back and forth, and it was kind of up to you what you played. Handel just said, do it in this harmony. Okay, so the majority of your embellishment is going to be there. And if you want to learn more about how to embellish that and how to compose that, that is a whole nother presentation that we will not be covering today. But I did want to acknowledge that not all fermatas are cadenzas. All right, so this information that I've given you today is only the starting point of your cadenza journey. I encourage you to read the period treatises that I have linked for you in the bibliography and given you quotes. Read articles from scholars on this because they tend to digest what the period treatises say and make it a little bit easier to understand versus the old style English or translated German, right? Use these parameters and the knowledge to learn to assess the pre-written cadenzas. So just because you have a book of pre-written cadenzas that you bought from Bärenreiter does not mean that they are all good. Because a lot of them are written in a very romantic style that are way more applicable to later 19th century composers than they are to Mozart. Okay? And feel free to recompose them. If it is a highly romanticized cadenza, you don't have to use the whole thing. Maybe you like the beginning part of it and you want to do a transition material to a trill after 10 measures. That's totally fine too, okay? And these rules that I've given you today are not one size fits all. Rules are meant to be broken as long as it's within good taste. And what is good taste, you may ask? You will know after you did it if it was in good taste. Because if it was not in good taste, there will be a Handel in the audience to tell you that was not a good idea. All right, happy composing. Thank you so much. I'm welcome to take questions at this point if you have any. The handout, it should be linked to the guidebook. I know it's linked on the live stream link. But if you want to give me your email, I have my presentation in a Google Drive folder. I'm more than happy to share that if you'd like to give me your email.
In particular, did you have any guidelines for how to not overdo it?
Like if you have a written out melody and you want to add ornamentation to a melody.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the Vivaldi second move from Piccolo Concerto.
Yeah.
Repeating that. How much is tasteful?
Yeah, so it depends on the composer, and if there are a lot of long note values, then you're going to want to add more embellishments. If there are a lot of shorter, like 16th note values, you're going to tend to add less, or maybe what Otater calls simple agrément, or flip trills and small little appoggiatures and that sort of thing. You're not going to completely recompose necessarily. So you have to kind of know the composer and how much they expected recomposing of their line. Yeah, yeah. Is there any